Hi, everyone. This is Rob Doggett with the International Yeats Society and the State University of New York at Geneseo, and I'm here today with Stephen Regan. Good to see you, Stephen. How are you?
Yeah, really well, thanks, Doug.
Great.
Um, I think last time you and I were talking poetry and songs, we were in a pub in Sligo talking late into the night.
Oh God, I miss it. I'm looking forward to going back there at some point, hopefully in the not too distant future. So you're emeritus now. So you were a professor of English at Durham and recently emeritus. So that's great. I hope you're getting some getting some relaxation in as well. But I know you've been busy and you're working on a lot of things. For me, the anthology of Irish writing is the book, and it's one of the books I always associate with you, and that's been incredibly useful for me whenever I teach. I really love that that work, and it's so handy teaching, of course, in Irish literature. But what are you up to these days?
Well, I finished a big book on the sonnet, Rob,
Sonnet, yeah.
and there's a chapter on the Irish sonnet, and Yeats is very much the presiding
Mm.
figure in that. And then more recently, the Penguin Book of Elegy, and
Okay.
of course, Yeats figures prominently, and so many great poems to think about in memory of Major Robert Gregory, in memory of Eva Gorbooth and Con Markievicz.
Mhm.
And then the big project I'm involved in now is the Oxford History of Poetry in English, which is in 14 volumes. Thankfully, I'm not doing it all on my own. I'm one of four editors under the general editorship of Patrick Cheney,
Oh,
who's
great.
doing a fantastic job. So I'm overseeing three volumes: the Romantic, the Victorian, and modern
Wow,
volumes. So there's enough to keep me going there, keep me off the streets for a while at least.
I bet. I bet. Well, that sounds great. So I'm really excited. So we're going to be able to talk about the Wild Swans at Coole, which is such a terrific poem. I was walking in the woods this morning with my dog, and I had a recording of it that I was listening to. A person reading it. It was really nice to walk in the woods and listen to it. But it was such a terrific poem. So I'm glad we're going to get to do this now. So why did you could have chosen lots to choose from. Why did you choose this particular poem?
Three reasons I think, Rob. I've always thought of it as a really vital transitional poem. I think the position it occupies in Yeats's life and work is so important, and maybe we haven't given it enough importance. It struck me just looking at Yeats's ordering of poems and the composition of his volumes that he made this the opening poem of the volume, The Wild Swans at Coole. A version of that came out in 1917, but of course the revised volume was 1919. And it looks as if he thought initially of having Easter 1916 as the opening poem.
Interesting.
As you know, he delayed it and had it printed privately, but not in a collection until 1921. And I think the relationship between these two poems of 1916 is
Mm.
really interesting. That's something I'd like to talk about. And of course, it is itself a poem full of images of transition
Mm.
in betweenness. And then
Mm.
the second point that I think really bears inspection is its function as a symbolist
Mm.
poem. Um, Yeats, as you know, had written the essay, The Symbolist, written the essay Symbolism of Poetry,
Mm.
in which he says very memorably, poetry moves us because of its symbolism.
Mhm.
And I think this is a poem that bears that out beautifully. So that's something I thought we could explore as well. And then the third reason, I think it's just one of the great lyric achievements of his career. I think everything he does with rhythm, line, syntax, meter, the idea of a poem having unity in the way that Yeats thought about has been disparaged a lot in criticism, unfairly, I think. If we look at a poem like this, we can see just what Yeats is aspiring to in terms of aesthetic unity and harmony. So I think it really invites that kind of close attention, looking at all the lyric facilities and features at every level, diction and syntax.
I had a great conversation recently with David Holdeman about the cold heaven, and I stupidly, as will sometimes happen in these interviews, I thought, well, the form's not all that complex, and then we went through it, and I realized, oh my God, it is actually really a complicated poem, and the syntax is one of the things we talked a lot about, and the kind of structure that doesn't feel structured. So I'm looking forward to talking form with you. So we'll do that. We can talk about the context, we can talk about the symbolism, we can talk about form, and we'll go through the poem. But let's start by reading it. So I'll share my screen here. I also have a copy of the draft. I know that you wanted to look at one of the drafts real quick, so we'll do that as well at some point. So, okay, can you see that?
I can. I have a book copy as well. So
okay, great. Yeah, I think I'll just share it now, and we'll read it, and then we'll go back to just conversation.
Good. I was listening to an old recording of Seamus Heaney at Coole Park, reading it, so I have a lot to live up to here. The Wild Swans at Coole. The trees are in their autumn beauty. The woodland paths are dry. Under the October twilight, the water mirrors a still sky. Upon the brimming water, among the stones, are 59 swans. The 19th autumn has come upon me since I first made my count. I saw before I had well finished all suddenly mount and scatter wheeling in great broken rings upon their clamorous wings. I have looked upon those brilliant creatures, and now my heart is sore. All's changed since I, hearing at twilight, the first time on this shore, the bell beat of their wings above my head, trod with a lighter tread. Unwearied still, lover by lover, they paddle in the cold, companionable streams or climb the air. Their hearts have not grown old. Passion or conquest wander where they will, attend upon them still. But now they drift on the still water, mysterious, beautiful. Among what rushes will they build? By what lake's edge or pool delight men's eyes when I awake someday to find they have flown away?
Thanks. That's lovely. What a just gorgeous poem that is. Okay, so you mentioned at the outset again the historical context, and this poem as a kind of transition and set against Easter 1916. So let's maybe talk about that.
Yeah, that would be very good, Rob. We don't ever want to reduce a poem to its biographical circumstances, and with a poem that seems to have such lyric innocence, we might tend to be shy of doing this, but I think we do have to place it because we can learn a lot from doing that initially. So if we think about what's happened between Responsibilities, his 1914 volume, and the arrival of the Wild Swans at Coole, the First World War, Easter 1916, the death of Major Robert Gregory, the death of Hugh Lane, Yeats's final rejection from Maud Gonne on his proposal of marriage, his rejection by Iseult. In this sense, it's a poem I think that comes out of and reflects upon important phases of change. It's a very meditative poem and a very elegiac poem, and I think it is worth reflecting for a moment what brings about that elegiac quality. It does relate to 1916, importantly, there's a line that calls attention to itself, partly because we might have heard it in Easter 1916, and that's the line, "All's changed."
Mm.
You know, that's crucially important, isn't it? Almost as if the poem is providing a link for us. It's carrying on the meditation. We can talk about some of the circumstances later, but you know, I wouldn't want to put too much emphasis on saying it's a post-revolutionary poem. That might be asking it to carry too much weight, but I certainly think it's a poem that's seeking sanctuary.
Mm.
It's a poem that seems quieter, more reclusive, meditative, and withdrawn than Easter 1916. And I think, as I was suggesting before, we do need to read the two together, because it seems that Easter 1916 was to have been the poem that would have opened this volume.
So much
Yeats,
from this period, Yeats becoming the sort of the public. I mean, so many of these poems with their kinds of grand enunciations that we get, and speaking on public matters, that contrast with this quiet kind of meditative poem, I think makes sense.
Yeah.
So what about the symbolism in the poem? Now, you talked about it as an important symbolist poem. I always talk with my students a lot about symbolism in Yeats. Usually I talk a lot about the 1890s, of course, and like The Wind Among the Reeds, but it's not as if Yeats abandoned symbolism, abandoned maybe the type of symbolism of the 1890s for a different kind of symbolism.
Yeah, I think that's where to begin, exactly, Rob, with 1899, the symbolist movement in literature. I remembered this morning that Arthur Symons had dedicated that volume to Yeats. And if you remember, what he says is that Yeats is the chief representative of this movement in our country, means England. Of course, much of this is an introduction for Yeats to poets who had used swans as prominent symbols, Mallarmé, Baudelaire. I suspect as well that Shelley's great image of the swan in Alastor informed some of his thinking. But the essay I mentioned earlier, The Symbolism of Poetry, seems to have been written by Yeats in response to Symonds's book. So Yeats's essay was 1900. And that line, "Poetry moves us because of its symbolism," is such a profound idea, I think. We have to read it in terms of the impersonality of poetry that other writers like Eliot and Pound are aiming for. Because Pound is saying things like, we have to get rid of the emotional slither of late Victorian poetry. The big challenge is how to write a poetry of feeling without it becoming sentimental.
Yeah.
And I think Yeats shows us that having a symbol or a set of symbols is a kind of obliquity or indirection that can allow you to write from the heart, as it were, but to avoid that collapsing into sentimentality. And I think he does it beautifully with this poem.
I agree with that. No, I'll just say real quickly, that's one of the things that I think when I teach Yeats, that is an important revelation for students, that one can get at these sort of affects, can get at emotion without it being the sort of confessional, direct sort of utterance. And I think that's really crucial here. And that is part of this sort of power of this poem. And so much of Yeats. I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, and I think the other thing about symbolism, Yeats says in that essay, the 1900 essay, that if we really believe that idea that symbolism moves us, poetry moves us because of its symbolism, it will encourage poets to adopt a particular kind of rhythm. And he talks about a wavering, meditative, organic rhythm. And I think this partly accounts for the kind of rhythm that he's seeking
Mm,
in the Wild Swans at Coole. And then, of course, the idea that symbolism leads us into something that is supernatural, that is
mm,
preternatural,
mm.
and that there is something of the mysteriousness of the swans that lingers at the end of this poem, that makes it the poem it is, I think.
Yeah, I think that some of the conversations I've been having about Yeats poetry have come back to that, the ways in which um, poetry in Yeats retains that level of mystery that exceeds or any sort of interpretation argument, and this kind of evocation, and how important that is. And I've been really connecting with that in reading poetry sort of during the pandemic, as a sort of been in a different kind of mind frame, and I think that's something I sometimes forget about why I initially loved poetry and why I return to these kinds of poems. So you're talking about the sort of rhythm, maybe a little bit on the form then of the poem.
Yeah, I don't know if we want to look at the poem again on the screen, or if we can just go through it maybe stanza by stanza together.
Let's do that. I think the screen's a little
Yeah,
bit funky, but I'm hoping people will
yeah,
have their books in front
yeah.
of them. So I've got mine. So let's do it that way.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think the thing to say about it is how accomplished, how assured it is at
Mhm.
the level of line and rhythm and rhyme. It's very good to look at the Cornell manuscript collection, the volume edited by Stephen Parrish. It reminded me of the line in Adam's Curse about laboring to be beautiful,
Mhm.
because he labored over this. There are 18 sheets of
Mhm.
manuscript
Mhm.
jottings, bringing it into being. So we can see in the earliest drafts how some images of autumn, of dryness, and then of water begin to come into effect. And then the numbering of the swans, and the poem begins to take shape. And there's a particular moment in the manuscript where he settles upon a 6-line stanza. This takes us into what Helen Wendler refers to as the architectonics of the
Mhm.
poem. And I think it's a great term actually to talk about the beautifully subtle construction of the poem. So we have a quatrain in effect, which might well derive from his interest in the ballad. So we have um, if you like, an alternation of a tetrameter and a trimeter line, slightly longer, four beat, 4-stress line, followed by a 3-stress line, as you would expect in the ballad. Of course, this is also the rhythm that he's employing in Easter 1916 as well.
Mhm.
It has an element of the popular about it, but then perhaps the great achievement, and you can see him jotting down this pattern in the manuscript, to have the penultimate line as this longer line of possibly 7 stresses, and then he pulls it back in, so you have again a curtailed line. So the alternation of line length and stresses there beautifully fits the theme of change and transience in the poem, because it's reaching out, coming back in, reaching out again. That's the wavering rhythm that Yeats is aiming for, I think, in his
Mhm.
essay on the symbolism of poetry. But the imagery too is just so poised. Um, it's autumnal. It's twilight. There's a reflective image there, isn't there, of the water mirroring a still sky. And then that beautiful word brimming. We don't often see brim used as a participle in that way, but
Mhm.
it's it fits this idea of transition and in-betweenness beautifully. And then I've always been fascinated by the 9 and 50 swans. And when I talk to students about it, interestingly, one of the lines that comes to mind from nursery rhymes is 4 and 20 blackbirds baked in a pie. And it's not a bad observation, because there is something very stylized about it. There's something heraldic or ceremonial about it. And of course, we know his fascination with numbers. And in the manuscripts, you know, he initially has 5 and 40. And then, so it's still an odd number. That's important. And some readers reflect upon the predicament of his own loneliness as that one, that one odd bird. But 9 and 50, presumably because he just turned 50 himself, hadn't he? He was 51, I think, when he returned to Coole in October 1916. But presumably the 9 and 50 does relate to the cycles of time. So it's 1 second before the minute, it's 1 minute before the hour. And it fits beautifully with the other imagery of rings in the great broken rings made by the birds in flight.
You've referred to the drafts a couple of times. Do you want me to post the image of the draft there that you sent?
We could look at it in a minute, maybe have a look at the poem, Rob, and then perhaps.
I just want to make sure I don't forget. So just say the word when you want to show that.
Yeah, we could perhaps come back to that. The counting continues, doesn't it? And he pondered in the composition of the poem, you know, what number to choose. But the 19th autumn, it would take us back to 1897. I checked Roy Foster's biography. It seems he had already visited Coole in 1896. That was the first visit. But Roy Foster says 1897 was the visit that really immersed him in the cultural life of Coole Park, made him feel at home there. So there is a reason, I think, for looking back to 97 as it would be. And this idea of counting, of course, is a numbering of his own years, isn't it? And seeing the birds wheeling in great broken rings, it's such a magnificent image, isn't it? And being able to combine the sound with the visual image, the clamorous. The
clamorous is always the one that strikes me, because you have that sort of upward vision, and then, as you're saying, the combination of the sound there. And clamorous is such a strange adjective there for that sound. It's not something we normally associate with sort of bird flight, although I've seen, there's a place where I walk near a lake where I often see my dog will chase their geese, and it is a bit clamorous actually when they take off. So yeah, lovely.
Yeah, part of the brilliance of the composition, you know, he'd initially arranged these stanzas so that what is now the final stanza was originally the third.
Yes.
And it appeared in the little review when that was its first printing, and I think decisively he chose to end it with the conjunction, but now they drift on the still water. But part of the brilliance of the compositional arrangement of the poem as we read it now is its tense. So we move from the idea of looking back into this I have looked, you know, his use of the perfect tense. It's just occurred to me in Easter 1916 as well. I is a tense he favors. It can be an indication of something habitual, or something he's done more than once, something that's happened fairly recently. But again, it's a useful transitional tense for him between past and future.
Mm.
I have looked upon those brilliant creatures, and now my heart is sore. It's such a great line, Rob, because it proves that point. I think that you can write so nakedly and personally, if you were able to frame it within this symbolist way. It reminds me of the opening of Keats's Ode to a Nightingale, of course. My heart aches.
Mhm.
And if we're looking for ways to think about Yeats as one of the last romantics,
Mm.
that persistence in writing about the heart. Of course, in Easter 1916, too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Here now, the heart is sore, but it's alive. It's it's vital. And there's the line that seems to pick up Easter 1916. All's changed
Mm.
since I hearing at twilight the first time on this shore, the bell beat of their wings above my head. That's beautiful, isn't it? In terms of its imagery, the bell beat, and what we might make of the imagery of tolling bells.
It's so
When
fascinating. As soon as I'd always, the alls changed. Of course, you think of Easter 1916, but realizing the same verb tense, the heart. Even I was thinking with brilliant creatures, the vivid faces. There's so many sort of little connections with
yes,
Easter 1916 right here. Um, and I do think it is magnificent. The bell beat of their wings above my head. Um, and then ending then with that shorter line, trod with a lighter tread, that gives us this kind of much more personal, and it seems more vulnerable, right? And I think that's right, what you're talking about, this kind of the symbolism combined with what we're talking about in terms of the structure, allows for that kind of, call it a kind of, to use a sort of loaded word, sincerity that comes out here.
yeah,
Yeah.
yes, that's right. There's a neatness and a concision in the language, even though some of it is
Yeah.
very colloquial. One of the things I like about his style, the way in which you can get a very elevated line, like companionable streams or climb the air, the bell beat of their wings, but also the more colloquial line, like my heart is sore. So in terms of the range and register of the
Mhm.
language, there's a great versatility to it. Some of it is just neat uses of alliteration, isn't it? Like trod with a lighter
Yeah.
tread has such a neatness and compactness, as does the companionable streams of climb the air. He's still giving us a kind of alliterative pairing there.
Mm.
Um, I wonder, when I get to the line, their hearts have not grown old. That's how I would tend to read it, stressing the there. And I was pleased to hear that Seamus Heaney's reading does the same. I think it invites us to make that that contrast, doesn't it? And
Mm.
I guess this takes us into the symbolism of the swans. Are the swans in some ways, even though they're viewed naturalistically, being elevated into creatures of an immortal kind, or like Keats's Nightingale, at least through art and literature, have a capacity for endurance at the level of symbol.
Mm.
There's a lot that can be said about the swan, and of course Yeats's use of it in other poems, an emblem of purity, um, emblem of passion, as the birds clearly are here, passion or conquest. And the word conquest also suggests something of the, the possible militant images of the swan that Yeats himself uses elsewhere. But I suspect part of what's attracting Yeats to the swan is that very old idea of a swan song, and the idea of a possible loss of inspiration as we move towards the end of the poem. It's just struck me as well that word attend is very interesting, isn't it? In terms of images of chivalry. There's something very courtly, perhaps.
It reminds me of some of the, we were talking before about the 1890s. It reminds me of some of the poems in The Wind Among the Reeds, where we have this sort of figures attending upon beauty as the eternal figure there, the woman.
That's right.
Yes. Knights in armor kind of thing around her.
Oh, exactly. Yes, that's part of what I was thinking about, Rob. Yeah, definitely. As I was saying before, I think part of the success in his rearrangement and realigning of stanzas is to give us the stanza with the conjunction, the but just draws in the attention in a very appropriate way, as does the word drift at the end.
It's such a different poem. I do that with my students. We read it in the two different forms, and it really helps them attend to just the basic arrangement questions here in this poem, and the meaning is quite different with that more affirming and attend upon them still, that kind of certainty. And you're right, the conjunction here is such a powerful change. Yeah. And the introduction of this mystery and uncertainty. Yeah.
And the fact that he ends with a question, as he does elsewhere, Easter 1916, very memorably, as a rhetorical device. Stephen Parish, who put together the Cornell volume of manuscript items, says that there's a haunting uncertainty about what that awakening might be. What does it imply? Is it a prefiguration of his own loss of inspiration? If that's part of what the swans are standing for. But I've always thought that the most effective symbols are those that cannot easily be reduced, to some neat correspondence between image and thing. And listening to Seamus Heaney in his reading recorded years ago at Coole Park, he says one of the things he likes about the poem is its elusive quality, that it's rooted in this local setting, and yet by the end of the poem it eludes the place, and he says something to the effect that the place Coole becomes a state of mind.
Yeah. That makes sense. And I think that, as you're talking, I've been thinking about the verb to awake there, and it's really interesting, because often when I'm talking about this poem in my classes, I talk about the importance of dreams in Yeats. So that fits with the reading you're talking about, where we move from dreams, the realm of inspiration, into sort of ordinary reality, which would be the loss of inspiration. At the same time, as you're reading the poem, that sense of, well, one awakes to realize something, that creates this really profound uncertainty, where it's almost impossible actually to pin it down to that one meaning. And
Yes.
I think the point about Heaney makes a lot of sense too, becoming this kind of state of mind, the way that, oh, it's more, in some ways, places become memories for us and
Yeah.
are so much more than just the literal place. Yeah.
Yeah. Is this some awakening on the other side, as it were? I mean,
Yeah.
to some extent, it's a poem built around antithesis, built around oppositions, as so many of Yeats's poems are. The here and the hereafter,
Mhm.
time and eternity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it just seems to hold those in suspension at the end.
Mm.
The rhymes are so good, aren't they? I like it very much when you've got a poet who can handle a couplet without it becoming too neatly epigrammatic. Um, one of the reasons Keats didn't like the Shakespearean couplet very much, though he warmed to it and used it extensively, was that it had that tendency to perhaps be too clinching or pouncing, as I think he put it. But stones and swans is such a lovely
Mhm.
coupling,
Mhm.
for
Mhm.
instance, and the fact that you've got the longer penultimate line and the more curtailed final line helps as well with the sound.
I think too, it's always interesting to see the third line in each stanza with the unrhymed,
Yes.
and that Yeats is so good at that, right? That
Mhm.
just that kind of variation of pattern that
Yeah.
um gives his poetry that sort of that feel to it where you sometimes forget how structured it is, how carefully crafted
Yeah.
it is. Yeah.
Yeah. We could perhaps have a look at that manuscript
Sure.
page, Rob. Do you
Sure.
think
Sure, let's do that.
you can?
There we go. Do you see that?
Yep, that's good.
Okay, good.
Um, One of the things I just wanted to draw attention to is that it was originally the Swans at Coole, and it might seem a very flippant point to make, but I think the insertion of the wild is telling. I don't think I've met too many tame swans myself, but obviously what Yeats wants to stress is the passionate freedom of the and perhaps it's wondering about that quality of life or quality of feeling in his own life that is perhaps slipping away, or that he fears he might have lost already.
Mhm.
But this is a phase in the composition where some of the shape has started to come into being. It begins, the woods are in their autumn colors, so we've got something close to the eventual line. The lake waters are low. We've got quite a lot of cancellation. There's a line, all paths dry under footfall, that he cancels and thinks about pathways being hard. He thinks about the pale twilight, about
Mhm.
5 lines, well, fourth line of the lines that are left standing there. That takes us back very much to the 1890s, doesn't it?
Mhm. Mhm.
Things like the
Mhm.
Curd Pale Moon in
Right, right.
earlier Yeats poems. But floating, he's got floating among the stones. The idea of counting, the 19th autumn is there. At one point, and I think you can probably just about make this out. He says, "I make no sound, for if they heard me, suddenly they would mount." So initially there was that idea of his own sound disturbing the birds, and a slow clamor of wings, really revealing, I think, to see how the clamor becomes
The clamor swings, yeah.
clamorous wings rather than the clamor of wings, yeah. And then they drift on the still water. He thought at one point about the future generation of the birds themselves, among what rushes will their eggs you can see they're presumably be laid, and he starts to compress it more and more. So I thought it was important to show that, just because of the the stitching and unstitching that goes on, just to quote Adam's curse again, and how a poem of such formal assurance comes out of that degree of labor and cancellation and rewrite. It's very humbling, I find, and very reassuring to see that a poem like this doesn't just magically appear on the page.
Yeah, that's the real joy, I think, of, in some ways, this kind of criticism, where we really are able to see and think through this process of creation, and it deepens, I think, the appreciation for how art works on us, and it gets us out of that realm. And we sort of talked about this earlier, of the notion that this sort of hackneyed romantic notion about sort of just communicating deep feelings, and that it's about the power of the feeling. And if you feel deeply, your poetry will somehow be moving. And that's not it at all. I mean, so much of this is out of the construction, and all that construction, I think, as you're talking, recognizing how carefully it's crafted to create then that quality of mystery and uncertainty, which is really, I think, that's what a great art does, I think. Yeah. Well, that's terrific, Stephen. So that's a lot of fun. I really enjoyed talking with you about this. Well, I learned an awful lot. I've got some new things to think about. I definitely think at the ending, I often fall back on the idea, okay, he's awakening from the fear of awakening from the world of dreams, which is the world of inspiration. What if he loses inspiration? But I think that the kind of ambiguity you're emphasizing at the end is really useful, and helps to explain something that, again, I think is difficult to convey with students. How does art convey that sense of mystery, that feeling we have where we're not certain and reaching for things, but not quite able to fully grasp them? But that is what the reason we often read poetry in the first place. All right, well, that was lovely. Thanks so much. I appreciate you coming on, and I look forward to seeing you. And we will, at some point, we will be in Sligo. We will have a pint together.
Oh, I really hope we can, Rob. That would be such a pleasure. No, thank you very much. I've learned a lot too, just talking from you, and good to have some things confirmed as well, that you often feel are just hunches when you're reading the poem yourself. But great idea, and all credit to you for organizing this series, Rob.
It's a blast. It's always, I get to learn so much and have such a good time.